try to maintain good posture.
Oh, I'm not. Mine's on the break until we start. Lunch.
We're good to go. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for our live streamers as well. We are SDUK in conversation with Kyle Abraham, which is fantastic. So, SDUK, we are an organization representing the interests and plight of stage directors throughout the United Kingdom, choreographers, movement directors, fight directors, intimacy coordinators / directors as well. We do many things. We advocate for better pay. We help members with disagreements, grievances. We advocate for better conditions within the profession itself. We also do social events. We do mentoring. We do special events to help directors expand their craft, and much, much more. We are presently in the process of becoming a trade union, which is very exciting, and it's been a wonderful process. Exploring, answering, asking questions, looking at not only the organization of SDUK, but our profession as a whole. And this change will not only affect us as an organization, it won't affect what we do or how we do it per se, but the effects will be profound for the profession of directors throughout the United Kingdom. We are on a mission, and our mission is to elevate, to support, and to bring our profession the respect that it requires, deserves, merits, and will have. You can find out more about us through our social media channels or visit us at our website, stagedirectors.co.uk, and you can always send us questions or anything, and we will get back to you. So, Kyle Abraham, welcome to Edinburgh, to the United Kingdom. Kyle Abraham is a choreographer, dancer, founder, artistic director of AIM by Kyle Abraham. Your company has grown, it seems, at an incredible speed. Does it feel that way to you, or does it feel like this has been a long evolution?
Yeah, I guess in some ways it seems like just time has gone by so quickly, but I feel like maybe in the same way that I'd like to think that it has for a lot of people, just in terms of the kind of weird milieu that we've all experienced with like a time suck, these past few years. But it's interesting thinking back to when I was in graduate school. I was on the ride over here, I'm like, oh my God, that was 18 years ago. So thinking about what that struggle was then, and knowing the struggles that I dealt with financially, let alone trying to start a company in the year that followed graduate school, it's been a really just beautiful experience, or like acknowledgement of where I might be now today, and knowing that my rent is paid, when before I was like, I have no idea I can pay any bills or anything. So that's been really beautiful, and to see the evolution of the company going from a place where, in terms of rehearsal fees or paying the dancers, I was like, I can bring a snack to rehearsal if you come, bring some M&Ms, and to know now that they're salaried with health care and retirement plan, like all that, 52 weeks, it's just a beautiful thing to know that we can do that to support the artists that we're collaborating with.
That is
and staff.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And may I ask, because how do you go from graduate school to having a company? How did that happen?
I don't have a good answer. I started the company when I was still in graduate school. I think in some ways that helped. I used being in school in New York City as an opportunity for me to go and see work, apply for shared program opportunities. So if there was a call for a choreographer to present a work in a shared evening, I would apply for those things. And in a lot of instances, I would either do a solo or I would do a group work, and maybe working with people that I was in graduate school with, and people that I met while taking classes on a Saturday in New York, things like that. But I think it's been a lot of just research, continuous research, and making opportunities in space to maybe not hang out with my friends, but do some grant research and write the grants myself and find residency opportunities and find a way to bring my collaborators to whatever residency it was. You know, even when if I didn't have the means, I would say, okay, well, we can use my food stamps that I have, I can use the government assistance that I have to pay for my groceries to make all our meals together. And we cooked together, and it actually just made us that much tighter as a unit, which is really lovely.
You talk about the grant writing, because all of us who have to go through that process, or have gone through that process, it requires an immense amount of energy, time, and it can be overwhelming, because quite oftentimes you feel like, I can't create, I want to be spending this energy creating. And how did you kind of manage to balance this?
Well, I think it's also creative in my mind, you know, the grant writing. I think it can be formulaic as well, because you know that there are certain systems at play in terms of the way that you need to start a grant, like that. What is that opening sentence? How are you kind of catching the reader? How are you having a little bit of like the flowery words, but also being really direct with your intention? And I think that also can help me to dream as a maker, because I can put these ideas in place, which is basically just like a science experiment. I'm kind of just hypothesizing, you know. In the case of a work like Pavement of mine, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to make a dance that uses Baroque era music written for concerto singers and tell the story of Boys in the Hood through the lens of me growing up in Pittsburgh in the early 1990s, and see what happens, you know. And that's what you put in the grant. And then it's like, okay, well, let me start going and making this work, and then reflecting on what I wrote and see if it still holds true. And so I think there's something that I enjoy about the accountability of grant writing and being the person that's writing the project narrative. So really me kind of hypothesizing or making some kind of synopsis of what it is I'm hoping to create. And then checking back however many months into the process to see how in line I am with what my intention was in the beginning.
That's a great approach. That really is. And do you find that having to go through that process of analyzing and being able to translate what's in your head into those words for a grant writer, a grant receiver to comprehend and understand, does that helps clarify the process at all?
It does. I think, you know, ideally, if I've written the narrative, there's less questions that I have to answer, you know, to an administrative staff or anyone else, because it's like, this is the thing. You know, you can take this thing I wrote, you can rework it for whoever, if there's a grant that is somewhat similar in its kind of verbiage, you know, you can make changes as long as it seems like it's respectful to what the intentionality is of the project. I mean, so much so that a lot of times what I would do is I would try and come up with different activities that I felt like connected to the work. So if we're doing some kind of element of engagement, which we always do in our work, what is the way I can connect the work to K through 12 outside of dance in a way that still holds true to the work?
And that's kindergarten through 12th grade.
Yes. And I think, you know, for me, I worked for a period of time at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh as an artist educator. And the whole point of that job was to find ways to connect people to Warhol's work. And trying to find fun, creative ways. So like even thinking about the oxidation paintings, which are, you know, tricky.
We commonly refer to as the piss paintings.
Right. But thinking, okay, but that's science, right? It's like, okay, it's the effect of urine on this paint and on the canvas that does what it does. So I was like, okay, well, what if we just get litmus paper and just do like we've all done in science class, acids and bases tests, you know, and then get watercolors and just have people recreate what they've done with those tests, with litmus tests, as a way to kind of like connect science to this idea and think about how we can bring painting into Warhol's work in a way. We're talking about gesture. So when I'm making the work, a lot of the times I think about what those connections are. So in a work like we're doing this weekend here in Edinburgh, I think like, you know, a work like An Untitled Love, I'm thinking about conversations with elders and talking about love in different ways and the kind of like ebbs and flows of long relationships, or the familial aspect of me growing up around my elders, and with those conversations, sometimes ignorant conversations that I wasn't around, or sometimes just really informative, and allowing that to be part of the process. So we would lead different discussions around love, and have different people from the community involved in those conversations. We sometimes play card games that I grew up watching my parents play. We play Spades, 500, Bid Whiz, Tonk, which are games that a lot of like people play in the Black community, in particular in the United States, but have conversations while playing those games.
Right.
And all of that reflects and connects to the work that we're presenting in that project.
You from Pittsburgh?
Yes.
Known as an industrial city.
Yeah.
Pittsburgh is an interesting creative hub because it's the home of two of the giants of 20th century art, August Wilson, the playwright, and Andy Warhol. How did the city of Pittsburgh feed you as a young person growing up in this environment, and how does that affect the work that's being made today?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of hometown pride for sure. But, you know, I think a lot of it's my parents. You know, I had just really supportive parents that would introduce me to a lot of things. We would go to hear jazz on a Sunday. We go to like a nice brunch in Pittsburgh and hear beautiful jazz musicians. But it's also the home of people like Art Blakey and Billy Strayhorn. You know, these amazing jazz musicians. But I think part of the interesting thing about a city like Pittsburgh is there's these beautiful museums, like the Carnegie Museum, the Mattress Factory, the Warhol, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of times where you can go in and there's nobody there, which is really, it's a good thing and a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Because it's something that like me and like my high school crush, we would go to the museum after school and just like, you know, just explore, just the two of us. Wow. And just, we could take everything in. We didn't have to wait for people to pass us. We could just stare at these like incredible works and just take it in a way that you can't really do in most cities. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a lot of that. It's a lot of just that blue collar mentality of the industrial city where, yes, we can appreciate art. We also still have to like grind in a way. And so knowing that and being part of like rave culture, that was a big part of my life in Pittsburgh. All of that I think plays a huge impact on the work that I make, the way that I look at dance and the visual arts and music. I think because they were all kind of, I don't know, they were connected in a way that I don't see in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was like a group that I got to be a part of in the early aughts, the Bridge Spotters, which was a collective of rappers, photographers, painters, dancer choreographers, poets. Everyone would just kind of gather and do just like performances. Maybe they were like pay what you can kind of thing, mm-hmm. All around the city. It was just really, really beautiful, really exciting.
That's been a wonderful kind of communal.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. I mean, Pittsburgh is a really wonderful city. Yeah, I mean, I haven't lived there in a minute, but we did this recent work in Pittsburgh in November, which is really special. On Cal Abraham Day.
It must be great going home, taking your work and having it seen.
It is, because I think, you know, even though my parents are no longer with me, a lot of the kind of aunts and uncles that helped raise me and the community, they really show up, which is really beautiful. And it's great to see the pride that they have in me and the success that they've helped to create. So it's just, yeah, it's really special. It's really beautiful. And I love being able to kind of interact with the Performing Arts High School. It's called Kappa in Pittsburgh, and try and make space for those students to come and see the work, and make sure we can kind of keep these connections going, and kind of thinking about these next generations. It's really fun.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I was going to mention this earlier. As you can see, I'm taking very free-flowing.
Oh, you're fine. You see, I'm like, long-winded on my end.
No, not
So,
at all. So you have been awarded the Bessie Award probably more than one.
I think just
one. Just the one.
Well, one, and there's an adjacent one for the Cunningham thing where I danced in it, but
Okay.
yeah.
And the Princess Grace statue, you received a MacArthur Foundation fellowship, commonly referred to as the Genius Grant, which is a pretty heavy thing.
Yeah. It's very special, very daunting. Yeah.
And it's interesting. You're the second person this year whom we've been in conversation with who has received that particular honor, and the other person from a very different field. She's a dramaturg, and one of the conversations that she and I were having, she was talking with me about dramaturgy for dance, which I had never ever even contemplated or even knew was a thing. And I found that so kind of stimulating, and my mind sort of going, oh, okay, how does this work? Do you ever work with a dramaturg?
Yeah, I've worked with my good friend Charlotte Brathwaite on this work pavement that I mentioned before, and I try and have her come in whenever I can, but it's tricky because she's so successful in her own right, so it's hard to kind of get that time to come in. But I think for me, it's more even working with like an editing advisor, I think, which in some ways serves a lot of that same purpose. You need someone that's asking you the why.
Yes.
And I think that's a big part of dramaturgy. And also saying, with Charlotte, she a lot of times with her, it's more, like more, So it's interesting to think about how much we can push my comfort level and my collaborators who are performing in the work push their comfort level with certain things, which is interesting. Maybe our approaches are very different, but it's nice for me to just talk about the intentionality behind whatever it is we're doing, and to be held accountable. I love that she's one of those people that helps hold us accountable. Risa Steinberg is another kind of editing advisor who, it's a bit adjacent to this idea of dramaturgy.
Wow, fantastic. I wanted to talk about An Untitled Love. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the conversations of growing up and witnessing, and the card games, and how you brought those elements into the process. It's interesting for me, kind of on the outside, because I believe you've talked in the past about your inspirations and about music and how you kind of do almost like a mixtape. What was it about the music of D'Angelo who, in a sense, made you want to create a piece where you would be creatively faithful to one?
Oh, right. Yeah, totally. I love that. I love his music. I think he stands for a lot of what I hope to represent in dance. I think his music is very much connected to a previous generation, while also staying really rooted in his own kind of urban experience. That's very present day. So you can hear the nods to Sam Cooke or Prince, while it's still being very authentically D'Angelo. His first album, Brown Sugar, came out when I was in my first year of college at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. I went to that school because my parents had gone to historically black colleges. They went to Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio. And that's where they met. And a lot of just cultural references that they would give me about their experience in college, I wanted to reference in this work. But I guess more so to the point, finding his music at that time has always been really kind of, I don't want to say influential because that seems a bit easy, but it's been in some ways like a close friend to me. When I was at a school that I thought was going to be bringing people together, when you're going to a school that's, historically about college, you think, okay, we're all going to come together. People found different reasons to segregate themselves from one another on the campus, and that album was my world, that was my friend. So much so that even when I went to art college the next year, I went to SUNY Purchase in kind of White Plains or Westchester, New York. It still stayed with me, and it helped me to even find friend groups because we would find that commonality in our love of D'Angelo and his music. And there's also just a vulnerability to all of his music that I just really kind of respect and love. And if you want to make something that is really just keyed in and focused on ideas of love in a more positive way, there's so much of his music that I just find to be so not only vulnerable but prideful in the way that he's expressing love.
And did you very early on, when you were introduced to his music, start thinking one day I would like?
No, not at all, not at all. I usually, honestly, with a lot of artists' music that I really love, I don't want to ever make a dance to because I don't want to keep that connection there for me for all time. But it's also a thing, like if I'm dating someone, I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to play Prince around you because I don't want to associate my love of Prince with, whoever I'm dating. Even if I marry that person, like, keep that to myself, I just want to have that different association. But I think I think there's something at the point when I wanted to, make this work that kind of honored the way in which we as a community love. D'Angelo seemed like the perfect choice, and I wanted it to be really focused. I made a solo work for myself to Bjork, but not in the way that, again, this is kind of hypothesizing, where I was like, oh, what happens if I took a gospel choir and had them sing Bjork songs? So I did that in New York, 2019, her work called Cocoon. And I loved that experience. I love kind of how concentrated that was. But we were already making an Untitled Love during that time. It just, the timelines of things, and then a pandemic happened because the work would have premiered in June of 2020 in Houston, but premiered in 2021. Yeah, in 2021 in Chicago. But yeah, I think that was a big part of it. Just thinking about what his music represented to me, and but prior to, I never thought about making a dance. No.
Wow. You mentioned the pandemic. I'm not going to dwell too heavily on the pandemic, but I wanted to ask about two recent events. The two recent I refer to as the twin disasters, and that is Trump and the pandemic. And I only feel that I can even bring this up now because I feel that we're in a slightly different place. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I just wanted to ask, how did these two events affect you creatively and as an artist?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll know for another 20 years. Like most works that I make are unintentionally referencing something from 20 years beforehand. Yeah, Pavement, the work about, thinking about Boys in the Hood and things like that. That's a work that's obviously coming from a film that came out around 91, 92. The piece premiered in 2012. Making a work about the Emancipation Proclamation and civil rights era of its time, and Max Rich's We Insist Freedom Now suite. It's like at the time in which you're thinking about apartheid in South Africa, that winds up being 20 years from its premiere, when that work finally premieres. So it's that thing I'm not really sure how to fully unpack. I mean, thinking about that election in 2016, I think that year was already a lot for me. I moved to Los Angeles to be with a partner, and the day that my luggage arrived and I got back from tour, the relationship was over. He was like, yeah, I can't do this. I was like, okay. So I had that, and my mother had passed just maybe 3 months before then. And although it's not on par, Prince had passed a month before that, and Prince was my introduction to dance. So ironically, even though you asked me the question about D'Angelo making a dance, when I told my mother I wanted to go to study dance on 2 occasions, because I did it first when I was 12, I was like, Mom, I want to go to school for dance, and I made up a dance to Prince on. And then I told her again when I was like about to go into high school, Mom, I want to go to school for dance, and I made another dance to his music. And then the first dance I made and shared in front of an audience was to his music. Wow. So it's that, it was all of those things all in a year, and then the realization of the way in which the American voting system worked, because that man, who I will not name, didn't win the popular vote. So it's great to know that there are more people in the country who hopefully were in support of kindness and generosity and empathy and all of these things, which we know that person is not. But the way that American system is, that's set up on racism and colonialism, it's just really, it's not shocking to me because I'm a Black gay American, but it's continuously humbling to witness the way that the system has set up. So it was a tricky thing. Ironically, I remember the day after the election, because I was going to a personal training session, and my trainer's mother had just passed away. And it was that weird thing where like someone told me at the front desk, but he didn't tell me. And so I'm like holding all this in, and I'm thinking about that election, and I was like, I feel like the floor is shaking. The floor's moving. He's like, oh yeah, it could be the weights. People are dropping weights. I was like, oh yeah, I'll be right back. And I had a panic attack. I couldn't, it was just too much. Everything was just too much. So it was just a tricky time. I don't want to give that previous president, I don't want to give him that power. But I think it was just so much change, and so much negative change, I think was just really, really challenging in that time. And ironically, again, thinking about the kind of like eerie serendipity of art making, I was making a work prior to all that loss about love, longing, and loss, a work called Dearest Home, which wound up premiering in 2017. So it was just like, okay, well, I guess there's not going to be any levity in this work. But since then, I feel like a lot of the work has been focusing, sure, still on themes of love, but in a totally different way. Yeah. There was a second part of your question about the pandemic.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think I'm still trying to make the space for me to consider how I have felt or am feeling during this time, because I worked throughout the majority of the pandemic, for better or worse. I know that like it's a complicated thing. I think sometimes people kind of like congratulate me for working during the pandemic, but I'm like, I also want to congratulate the people that were like, no, I can't do this. I mean, that's a beautiful thing to know when you can't.
Absolutely.
And to take the power to be like, yeah, I'm not going to. And that's not what I did. so I think like I've been trying to figure out what that means for me, and trying to do so in a way that I'm not resentful, which I can admit to saying that there are definitely times where I have been very resentful to people around me who had time off, or have been able to make whatever way they can to have that healthy time off away, even though it can seem like, I have all these blessings, which they are blessings, but it's just like, okay, well, how am I able to process? How am I able to work on my personal life? For so much of this pandemic, which, we're still in, with lockdowns that we've had in different ways, I was trying to be so conscious of everything I was doing, that like trying to be a single person, not trying to be, I didn't want to be a single person, but being a single person in the pandemic has been really challenging, especially in the early time. And it's not about wanting to be around people or not, but it's like we're still aging during the pandemic, and in gay years, it's a whole different thing. So, I just feel like, wow, this is really tricky. And then knowing that like when we get to a different stage of this pandemic, the touring's going to kick up, and then will I have had time to establish a relationship that can sustain and my touring schedule that's already established? So it's just, I don't know, I'm still very much unpacking it, but making that much more space to talk about how I feel on a more kind of like conscious level that also acknowledges there are other people in the room, and I I'm all sucking up there, talking about my feelings. But trying to be that much more aware of how I'm feeling has been a big part of that. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that I can say is a positive is focusing and remembering that every day there's a negotiation of trust with the people you're working with. You shouldn't make any assumptions about that trust on either end. So if I'm walking into the studio to work with my collaborators and I'm like, I need y'all to trust me, I also need to make sure that they feel that they can have that trust towards me, and I don't know what happened to them on their way to work that day. So I just think every day now I'm trying to be that much more conscious of what that reciprocity is and what that kind of trust is supposed to be for us to make vulnerable work.
So in 10 plus 15 years, we will hopefully get to see.
Maybe. Who needs a pandemic ballet? Yeah, who knows? Who knows what it'll be?
But you mentioned your great passion for Prince.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you, growing up during the MTV era.
Yeah. And BET.
And BET.
Oh yeah, it's probably not the same here.
Yeah. So
BET Souls.
Was that your introduction to dance, or did it happen in a different way? How did dance find you?
Well, I have a sister who's older than me. She probably doesn't want me to say how much older she is, but I have an older sister. And she, it's a family, friends, they would be dancing around and trying to teach me the social dances of that time.
Okay.
Yeah, the Roger Rabbit, the Kid and Play, Running Man, all that stuff. And so that was part of my world. Before I was even focusing in on the music videos, and if I was, I think ironically, I was probably watching, depending on rotation, could have been like ZZ Top, like Legs, that video was on all the time, more so than a lot of videos that had more dancing involved, which I feel like you were seeing more of in a kind of late 80s and early 90s. You were seeing that much more kind of like people taking advantage of dance in a fun way. But yeah, we had Soul Train, so it was like that was always the reality to watch that on a Saturday, But yeah, I don't know, I think the biggest thing for me with things like MTV and BET was, again, with this idea of Prince, is seeing an artist who can kind of live in these different worlds in a way that was accepted. He could have a pop record and have an R&B record at the same time, and he wasn't faulted for that. Or an artist doesn't go by Terence Darby anymore, but Terence Darby was another artist at that time who would have a song on BET and a totally different song on MTV. And that's another one of those things I was thinking about during this pandemic. I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing. I like making these ballets at Royal Ballet and City Ballet, but then I can make something with my company that's so not that, which is fun. And sometimes, I want to be really crunchy and look at release technique and, think about, time-based art in a different way, durational work if I could. But then I also know on the other side, I got to make the short thing that fits into a program, however length. So I love all that, and artists like Prince and Terence Darby really kind of helped me to think about that.
Okay. You have beautifully led me to my next question.
Even am I rambling?
Thinking about your work and the way you move from different dance genres, worlds, I've been really curious as to, and you've kind of answered a lot of that question about the thinking, about where that comes from. And I'm reminded of other choreographers who had that ease between moving to different fields, like Jerome Robbins with his Broadway world and his New York City Ballet world, and even Balanchine to a degree, Ballet Russe and then Broadway and City Ballet, and I find that really fascinating because I've watched a wonderful video of you in rehearsal with the Royal Ballet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had a good time.
And these phenomenally trained, beautiful classical dancers, and you working with them, and I was so touched by their openness and the way that they were so willing to just kind of explore. And so my question in a very roundabout way is, what is that like, being able to move from these two different worlds of working with your company, whom you have a relationship with, and then going in a sense, as a freelancer, to a company with a different identity, with dancers whom you may not know?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's elements of complication there for sure, and a lot of freedom as well, because, well, several things. So I have to think about the negatives so I can end with the positive. I think like one thing is, my time there is fleeting, right? So it's also a thing, if the energy's not right, because I do work, not to be super hippy-dippy, but I do work off of energy. So like, if our energy's not right, don't come back. Like, I don't think this is the right project. Maybe in another year or two, maybe we'll be in a different place, but like, let's just not do this. But when I have a company, I don't really have that same, it doesn't work the same way. If they're in the room and they're a company, they're salaried, all the things, you just hopefully got to get over whatever the issues are, or whatever. But when I'm working in these commission projects, I don't have to have that dancer ever back in the room. So there's that. But then there's this whole other thing, which I'm still dealing with right now with another company, where depending on the casting, I think at Royal they have been really kind in the way of like, I do get time to learn the dancers before I say this is the cast. Because I think that's really important before you get any relationship with. Let me learn you. You learn me. Let's see if this is going to be a good match. But in some cases, I don't get to do any of that. And in some cases, they may ask me for the costume, which costume are included in this dancer that I've never actually worked with or ever seen do my choreography. I don't know. So it can be really complicated depending on the amount of time that you're given to make a work. But at Royal Ballet, they're very, very generous with not only the time, but the kind of support that they give to a process and to kind of making that happen. But again, it's that energy and it's that level of trust. So I think a lot of the dancers you're watching, and that the kind of insight, I think is what they call it at Royal. I think, I had Liam Boswell, Joshua Yunker, and Natalia Osipova, I think is the one you watched. Yeah, I mean, I had a great time with them every time that we were in the studio, and I think it seemed mutual. So when I can kind of build those relationships, and with those three in particular, we were able to kind of get to know each other. It helps the work. And with AIM, it's a similar thing where, because I can be that much more in control of the length of time where I'm making a work. So in the case of An Untitled Love, it's something that I kind of started turning the wheels on in 2018, knowing that the work would premiere in 2020. There's space to kind of work together, step away from time, from the studio, and also use studio time to sit and talk. And I think that was one of the things for me in this pandemic, as someone who did not want to rehearse on Zoom, like not a fan. I was like, okay, well, we can still talk, and if anything, this is the best time to do it. Yeah. So we would sit and we would talk about, we would have viewings, each person would recommend a film or a TV episode or a reading that they felt connected to the character that they were interested in exploring in this work. And then the next day we would unpack that and talk about that as a group for 2 hours or something. And just talk about how we were feeling about the isolation and whatever else we were experiencing during that time in particular in 2020. So yeah, it's great to have that space to kind of breathe and talk whenever I'm making and wherever I'm making. And you know, in the past at New York City Ballet, I've loved in the past having the space to have a communication with the rehearsal director about what we're making and ask the dancers, you know, how do you feel about this? And for them, it can be really daunting to have a voice. And that's been the case at Ailey. You know, I'm back at Ailey, super soon making new work there. And the last time I was making an Untitled America, which we were talking about before, making that work there, and it was interesting because that was my second piece for the company. And so the first time I was there, I'm asking them and their opinions, and everyone's like super quiet because they're not used to being able to have that back and forth. So it was great to be able to go back however many years later, I think it was maybe three to 4 years later, making a work, and some of them were that much more familiar with my process. And they were able to kind of like dive into that much more. And already we kind of had our audition day 2 weeks ago, I think it was. It was great to kind of just have that back and forth in a fun way, because I need that. I need it to be conversational in the studio as much as possible.
Your company travel across America and internationally. Do you feel that the work is viewed differently based on where you are?
Yeah, very much so. And sometimes it's really shocking. I mean, yeah, even, I don't want to call out a city in a bad way. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, well, here's a good example is a place like Seattle, which I've always found to be really cerebral in a way that's really exciting. But it can also be the work that we're presenting at different times there. In the past, before doing an Untitled Love there, the audience would be really quiet, and then afterwards, this kind of just, you know, glorious applause and standing ovation, the whole thing, and it's like, oh my God, they really dug it. It was hard to know in the process. Right. But then when we were doing this there, they were like actually responding out loud to things. I was like, oh my God, I'm not used to this for Seattle. So but it was a different audience. Maybe our audience is growing and we're getting, you know, more reach. But yeah, no, it can be very different. There's some cities, I remember, I'll say this without saying the city. We did a 5-city tour in Sweden of this work, Pavement. The applause, like the encore bows were so long that and we started choreographing multiple encore bows because we just didn't want to look stupid. So we did that, and then we came back to America, and we did it in a city that, well, whatever, I'll call them out, I don't care. No, I shouldn't do that, no. To watch myself. We did it in a city in America where, I thought, I should also say all those shows in Sweden all sold out. And these are like 2,000 seat venues, the whole thing sold out. Then we do it in this certain place in America, it was the last tour of the year. There were maybe 50 people in the audience, maybe. And it was the complete opposite. We were like, oh, we're going back to the States. They're going to love this. Listen, our people, they know we've been going through, no.
They didn't get it.
It was not like, I don't know, it was crickets.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then there's one American city where we went to where I wasn't even supposed to go on the tour because I don't tour a lot of times with the company, and I was like, oh, I'm going to this because I want to be in that audience. It's gonna be live, and it was like oddly quiet. But the interesting thing in that case was, I don't even know if I would chalk that up to the city. It could also have also been the presenter. How did they prepare the audience for this work? Mm-hmm. Everywhere else we've been with this work in particular has been like extremely well received. So to have been in that city in particular, which I'm not naming, I was really surprised. But yeah, it's different everywhere we go for a host of reasons. Throughout Europe, it's always very different. And in the States, America, as you know, or as we're definitely learning, especially in these last so many years, as you were talking about the previous election, you're seeing how contentious things can be throughout the country. Even within a city, how divided things can be.
Wow.
I remember, this is related but unrelated. we're doing a show at the Joyce Theater in New York, our 2018 season. And I had to work on the program. It's called Meditation, a Silent Prayer. And it has a backdrop by Titus Kaphar, which has several illustrations of several people that lost their lives way too soon to police violence or what have you. And it's a text by Carrie Mae Weems, a visual artist. And so that's on that program. There's like, you know, some work by Andrea Miller, work by B.B. Miller, Doug Verone. I had another piece or two from that I choreographed for the company on the program as well. And at the end of the show, we were doing a question and answer, post-performance discussion. And someone gets up and they're like, you know, I didn't come to this show for politics or whatever. I came to this show for dance or whatever. I said, oh, well that's great. You got more than what you wanted for. So it's interesting because that's even in New York City. You know, I'm like, oh, that's great. How come we gave you lots?
You got extra.
Yeah, you got extra. Got some politics and a pirouette. Okay. You know.
So I wanted to ask you about, because your book seems that it must be very all-encompassing on many levels. And I'm curious as to how does Carl Abraham feed himself on a kind of a creative level, but also just that human thing. Is there any area that you like to just retreat to or experience that you can?
Yeah. I don't know, it's interesting because, well, it's become an obsession, and it's, you know, UK based, but Love Island is one of my respites. And a source of inspiration. It's a good season, Team Day, you know. But I think
I'm surprised. I have to say, of all the things, that is not one that I would have imagined. I'm gonna have to.
I love it. So good. But you know, I think part of it was because I can't remember what show I was watching, and I was watching a show in America. Oh, you know what? It was during this pandemic. So during the pandemic, I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna watch shows where people can't go anywhere. I'm gonna watch Survivor and Big Brother. They can't go anywhere. So I watched both of those, and then it was a thing where in the US, it's like, if you're recording it, the next show sometimes just starts. And Love Island, the American version, was starting, and I was like, oh, you know, I haven't been in a relationship for years, and I'm making this work about love. I should see what these young folks, like what the conflicts are, what's the whole thing. And I just kind of got sucked in. But like that's a good bit of escapism where it's still work related. Or this Requiem, Fire in the Air, the Earth is a new work that we premiered summer of 21, but we just did it in Lincoln Center last weekend. It's a work where like I started watching all these like vampire shows, Vampire Diaries, the originals, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes as an escapism, but then I'm like, oh, I'm focused for my Requiem, instead of focusing on death, I wanted to look at reincarnation, folklore, mythology, afterlife, like have that be part of the conversation. So allowing myself to escape into like vampires, werewolves, and all this stuff actually fed the work and gave me a bit of space. I think I'm also in this time, as I'm like trying to focus on like my needs, ideally no more work after 9 p.m. So like, don't call me. I'm not gonna look at my emails because I know that my brain is gonna keep going after 9. But like things like that have been helpful. Again, like this idea of playing cards with this show, that's what I love to do. Like if I can hang out, I'm gonna play spades. I'm gonna play board games. So if I can bring that into the work and selfishly get a couple hands in, I'm all for it. Yeah, that definitely is healing for me. That in reading, I think. This work in particular, I didn't do that much reading for, but the Requiem work, I was reading a lot. Some cases it was going back and rereading things that I'd read in the past, but yeah, sometimes it's just trying to find those resources and a little bit of escapism to just turn off, or maybe just turn the page, literally and figuratively.
And you mentioned the Requiem, and am I correct that you use Mozart's Fifth as the musical?
Ish.
Ish.
Yeah, I worked with this composer Jay Lynn, who she was nominated for the Mercury Prize in the UK for her album Black Origami several years back. But yeah, we just really hit it off. She came in and we collaborated, but we used a lot of Mozart's work to kind of be the kind of flower to the root, shall you say? But a big jumping off point of inspiration. Yeah.
And it's an interesting one as a jumping off point because it's an unfinished
exactly.
piece, so that must be quite interesting.
It is, but I think the thing is anyone that really knows that history, I think they'll maybe get the inside joke of when the music really starts to become that much more kind of like Jay-Lenified, because that's part of what I was playing with these things, and in a really kind of maybe like dark, macabre kind of way. Like I think nothing is promised, right? We have no idea when we're gonna go, and so I think for me, at the time of making that work, focusing on death as much as I was, with my mom's passing and everything else, I just was like, yeah, I don't know how much longer I'm gonna be here for. So I started making that work, not knowing if I would finish it. So that was something that I think was drawing me to making it and to thinking about how I can approach these ideas in a way that gave me a little bit of energy during darker periods.
Which can shift time because I'm conscious of the fact that you do have a tech rehearsal. You know, it doesn't stop. So I wanted to just think about the field of dance, of movement, which primarily is visual. We experience it as an audience primarily as a visual and oral thing as well. How do you approach development of theme, character, mood without the luxury often of having a text taking you in a certain direction?
A lot of it is maybe freedom and imagination. Everything is very, I don't want to say, maybe it's experiential in a way or referential to a previous time for me. And so it's fun for me to think about these disruptions or interruptions I can create in a work to play out different scenarios. And I think when I'm thinking about text, I think about text in the same way I think about music or movement or costuming. One of my composition or choreography teachers I had in school, her name was Kazuko Hirabayashi, and when she gave me an assignment to make a dance with a prop, if you can make that dance without the prop, you didn't make a dance with the prop. And so for me, if I'm using music or if I'm using text, I have to know that the thing wouldn't exist without it. And so it has to really serve a purpose, or for good food reference, I know that I need that spice. Like the dish is just not going to be right without it. So in some spaces, I need silence. And in some spaces, I need sound, abrasive sound, calming sound. I need levity in this moment. Maybe it requires text. Maybe it requires someone talking so much that they exit and you still hear them in the back of the space while you hear the music to prove a point or to connect us to the reality of these human beings that I want to portray in a work. So all of that is just, I think, just part of that freedom and curiosity and imagination.
The word curiosity, that's key. I think for all artists, if we're curious, we're asking, we're willing to go a little bit further into the unknown, and that can be really fulfilling and exciting, and a little scary as well.
Yeah. But there's hopefully some joy in there, Yeah, for sure.
So I want to ask if anyone had any questions before we go into our next phase? Because if not, it's okay, because I have one more that I would like to bring in, and I think this is something we all have in common as creatives. How do you, what's your relationship to criticism, to critics? To, you know, that's something that, yeah, it's a part of our world.
Yeah, it's funny, I was thinking about that this morning while I was brushing my teeth. I was actually thinking about, like, when are critics ever being criticized in the way that it connects to a way in which we are criticizing our work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know, because I was thinking about there's several critics who may not be writing something that is like favorable, whatever, about my choreography, but they're skilled in what they're writing in a way that, like, I can see what they're saying. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then there's some that are just poor writers and write just dribble, and there's no accountability for that. And in some cases, some of those writers are in these places of power that people might be giving them, you know, because I think that maybe they're not aware, maybe they are, that like there are presenters in our field who will read a review and not go and see a work or not present the work because of a negative review by someone who isn't even good at their job.
They're not qualified.
They're not qualified. No. And I think I don't know. There's so many layers to all of it. I do think as makers in our fields, we can grow and learn from critique. I definitely love it when people tell me where problems are, because if you're not telling me where the problem is and you're in my circle, you're actually not support. The opposite. So I love that. I more times than not, I want to hear what's negative or what's bad or what can use improvement than I want to hear the good stuff. But with a critique, it has to be a critique, and there's an art to critique, and so many of us, and I know a lot of people in the visual art world, have to like study and do crits, you know, on the regular basis. Like maybe it's once a week. But what is that process for a dance writer who's calling themselves a critic? Are they doing so in an artful way that actually is never dismissive, but it's telling an audience maybe what they saw or didn't see, and giving perspective and point of view and reference? Because without that, have they done their job?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting because I have this thing where I believe a good critic is someone I can read a review. I may not agree with what they're saying, but it helps me to see the work in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I love that. I dig that. I mean, ironically, for AIM or for my work, I don't generally read the reviews unless I'm going back to, like, I think when we did the Requiem work, I knew we were about to do it in New York, and it had been maybe a couple months from the last time we performed it. I was like, oh, there are some sections I want to look at. Let me read the reviews from the last performance and see if they'll inform something. Unfortunately, they were all they were all kind of passive in a way that, like, I don't know who this supports, but I think it was interesting reading them because I felt like those reviews were comparing what I did for a totally different type of work for a different company to what I was doing with AIM, even though I said ahead of time in all the previews, this is nothing like that. Like, you had the heads up. Yeah. So that was interesting. But yeah, I try to, if I can, make the space to read them if it seems relevant to me restaging a work or bringing it back and seeing what I can learn from it. But I definitely try not to, for my own mental health, read them during the time that the work is up. I used to say, sure, I'll read them when I'm really depressed because it's not going to make me happy and it's not going to make me feel worse because I'm already down.
Yeah.
You know, but in more recent years, I haven't really, I haven't read the review from New York from the show that we just did last week. I haven't looked at any of them. This show, ironically and unfortunately, it's the same critic whether or not he wrote a positive thing or not, the review that he did of this show, which people could consider to be positive, it was just bad writing. So, and it's unfortunate because everyone I know has really responded well to this show, and every review has been extremely favorable. And ironically, that one was its version of favorable. It just was, there was just no information. And it's just sad. Just sad. But again, but the other reality is, you know, I don't know what he, this writer, this male critic, I don't know what he was going through or is going through in his personal life that has him phoning in his work.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's been a time, I definitely made a dance or two that felt phoned in. And I think a couple of his, you know, criticisms have been a bit phoned in, unfortunately. So hopefully he's okay in his personal life.
But on that positive note,
Yeah.
thank you, Kyle, so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and I am so looking forward to seeing an Untitled Love this evening.
Thanks, it's a fun time.
Thanks everyone for being with us. Thank you for joining us, and have a fantastic Saturday.